The digital clock on the oven read 11:47 p.m. Rain slicked the glass of the kitchen window, blurring the orange glow of the single street lamp that guarded the corner of Elm and 3rd. Sarah pressed her ear against the thin wood of the apartment door, her breath held tight in her chest. Every sound was magnified. The groan of the building's ancient pipes, the distant wail of a siren, the frantic drumming of her own heart. But beneath it all was the sound she had been dreading, the sound that had become the metronome of her fear. A soft, metallic scrape against the lock. It was not the confident scratch of a neighbor's key. It was hesitant, exploratory, testing. He was here, again. She backed away from the door, her bare feet silent on the worn linoleum. Her gaze darted to the small bedroom where her 6-year-old son, Leo, slept. His small form a gentle rise and fall beneath a superhero-themed comforter. He was her whole world, the anchor that kept her from being swept away by the current of terror that was her life now. The scraping stopped. A profound silence followed, thick with anticipation. Sarah grabbed the heaviest thing she could find in the kitchen, a cast-iron skillet, its weight a pathetic comfort in her trembling hands. She knew it was useless. Mark was twice her size and fueled by a possessive rage she could no longer comprehend. The silence stretched, each second a lifetime. Then, a new sound. A soft thud against the door, followed by the whisper of an envelope sliding underneath. Sarah didn't move until she heard the faint echo of footsteps descending the communal staircase. She waited another 5 minutes, her knuckles white around the skillet's handle, before she crept forward. The envelope was plain white, no name, no stamp. Inside was a single photograph, a candid shot of her and Leo at the park that afternoon. He was on the swings, his face alight with a joyous, innocent smile. She was pushing him, her own smile small and tired, but present. On the back, in Mark's familiar, sharp handwriting, were 3 words. "You still belong to me." The skillet clattered to the floor as her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sob that threatened to wake her son. The system had failed her. The papers she had filed, the calls she had made, they were all just rustling leaves in the face of a hurricane. Tonight, the hurricane was at her door, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that one day soon he would not be content with just sliding a picture underneath it. He would break it down. The next morning, the fluorescent lights of the 4th Precinct lobby hummed with an aggressive indifference. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Sarah sat on a hard plastic chair, the photograph clutched in her hand, its corners now soft and frayed from her anxious grip. She had been waiting for 45 minutes. Leo was with Mrs. Gable from next door, a kindness Sarah felt she could never repay. Finally, a name was called. Sarah Jenkins. She approached the high counter, looking up at Officer Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a state of weary skepticism. She explained everything, her voice low and strained. The late-night visits, the feeling of being watched, the constant calls from blocked numbers. She finished by sliding the photograph across the worn countertop. Miller picked it up, glanced at it, and turned it over. He read the inscription and his expression didn't change. "You have a restraining order against this man, a Mr. Mark Stanton?" he asked, his tone flat. "It expired last month," Sarah said, her throat tight. "I didn't renew it. He promised he was getting help. He said he would leave us alone." Miller let out a slow, tired sigh, the sound of a man who had heard this exact story 1,000 times. "Ms. Jenkins, a photograph and a note are not a direct threat. It's unpleasant, I'll grant you, but his handwriting on the back of a picture of his own son? The prosecutor would laugh that out of court. He hasn't broken any laws here. He was at my door at midnight," she insisted, her voice rising with desperation. "He was trying to get in. He's stalking me." "Did you see him?" Miller asked, leaning back in his chair. "Can you prove it was him at the door?" "Who else would it be?" she cried, gesturing at the photo. "Look at this. This isn't normal." "From a legal standpoint," Miller said, pushing the photo back toward her, "it's a domestic dispute. He's the boy's father. He has a right to be in his son's life." The phrase domestic dispute was a cage. It minimized the terror, repackaged it as a private, messy affair that the law was reluctant to touch. "He doesn't have a right to terrorize us," Sarah whispered, the fight draining out of her. "My advice," Miller said, his gaze already drifting to the next person in line, "is to go back to the court and file for a new order. Get a lawyer. In the meantime, unless he makes direct contact or physically harms you, there's not much we can do. We can't arrest a man for leaving a family photo." He stamped a form on his desk, the sound like a gavel falling on her hope. She was dismissed. Sarah walked out of the precinct and into the harsh morning light, the photograph feeling like a lead weight in her hand. The system wasn't just failing her. It was actively telling her she was on her own. The message was clear: your fear is not our problem. As she walked the 6 blocks back to her apartment building, every shadow seemed to lengthen, every passing car seemed to slow down. The city, once a place of anonymous safety, now felt like a hunting ground, and she was the prey. Her apartment was small, just 2 rooms and a kitchenette, but it was their sanctuary. Or it was supposed to be. Sarah had worked hard to make it a home. Leo's crayon drawings of dragons and rocket ships were taped to the refrigerator. A pot of basil, her one attempt at gardening, sat on the windowsill, its leaves wilting slightly. The worn floral sofa was where they read stories every night, and the small kitchen table was where Leo painstakingly practiced writing his name. These were the mundane, beautiful artifacts of the life she was trying to build, a life free from the shadow of Mark. That shadow, however, was etched into her very skin. On her right shoulder blade was a tattoo of a thorny rose, its petals a deep, blood red, its stem a twisting black vine. She had gotten it years ago, back when Mark's intensity felt like passion, not possession. He had designed it himself, sketching it on a napkin in the diner where they'd had their first date. He called it their symbol. He had the exact same one on his forearm. At the time, she had thought it was romantic, a permanent declaration of their bond. Now she saw it for what it was, a brand, a claim of ownership. She remembered the day he'd insisted she get it. His voice had been low, persuasive, but with an undercurrent of something hard and unyielding. "So everyone knows you're mine," he'd said, smiling. She had laughed it off then, but the words had settled uncomfortably in her memory. After she left him, the tattoo became a source of shame. She wore shirts that covered it, even in the summer heat. It was a constant reminder of her mistake, a secret scar that pulsed with the memory of his control. Her life before Mark had been simple. She'd been a waitress, saving up for community college, dreaming of becoming a pediatric nurse. He had swept into her life with a charisma that was blinding, showering her with attention that filled a void she hadn't even known was there. The control started subtly. He'd critique her friends, suggest what she should wear, get quiet and cold when she wanted to visit her family. By the time she realized the beautiful garden he'd promised was a cage, she was pregnant with Leo, and the lock had already clicked shut. Leaving had been the hardest thing she had ever done. She had saved money in secret, a few dollars at a time from her tips, hiding it in a hollowed-out book. One Tuesday morning, while he was at work, she packed one bag for herself and one for 2-year-old Leo, and she ran. The restraining order had given her a year of fragile peace, a year where she and Leo had started to breathe again, a year that was now over. The following week was a slow-motion nightmare. The escalation was insidious, a campaign of psychological warfare designed to unravel her. On Monday morning, she found one of her car's tires slashed, the rubber gaping open like a wound. She had no proof it was him. The police report she filed felt like a hollow gesture. She had to take the bus to her job at the diner, leaving Leo with Mrs. Gable for longer than she was comfortable with. On Wednesday, a bouquet of dead roses was left on her doorstep. No note, just the brittle, brown petals and the cloying smell of decay. The landlord, Mr. Henderson, a man who communicated primarily through sighs and eviction notices, told her he couldn't do anything about pranks. He refused to change the lock on her front door, citing building policy. On Friday, her boss, a stern but fair woman named Maria, pulled her aside. "Sarah, I got a strange call today," she said, her brow furrowed. A man said he was from the Family Services Bureau, asking questions about your reliability, about whether you've been showing up to work on time. Sounded fishy, so I hung up. You know anything about that? Sarah's blood ran cold. He was trying to get her fired, to sever her last lifeline of independence. She assured Maria it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, but the shame burned in her cheeks. The police were called again after the roses, and again after the call to her work. Each time the response was the same. There's no crime here. We don't have the resources to investigate a phone call. You need to understand, Ms. Jenkins, he's being careful. He knows the line. Until he crosses it, our hands are tied. Her world shrank. She stopped taking Leo to the park. She asked Mrs. Gable to pick him up from school. Every trip to the grocery store was a frantic, head-on-a-swivel ordeal. The apartment, her supposed sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The windows were always locked, the blinds always drawn. She and Leo lived in a perpetual twilight, whispering as if Mark could hear them through the walls. He was a ghost haunting their lives, and no one else could see him. The frustration was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She was doing everything right. She was reporting the incidents, she was documenting the harassment, she was trying to follow the rules. But the rules were not designed to protect her. They were designed to protect the system itself from liability, from having to get involved in something messy. She was a loose file in a cabinet full of them, waiting for her case to escalate to a level of violence that would finally warrant a response. She feared that by then, it would be too late. It was a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks after the photograph under the door. The air was thick with the promise of a summer storm. Their small refrigerator was nearly empty, and Sarah could no longer put off a trip to the corner market. She held Leo's hand, her own slick with nervous sweat, as they walked the 2 blocks. Leo, oblivious to her terror, chattered happily about a new cartoon he had seen. His innocence was a fragile shield against the world, and she felt a desperate, primal urge to protect it. The market was on a corner next to a gas station. As Sarah paid for milk, bread, and a small chocolate bar for Leo, she noticed a group of 5 men by the gas pumps. They were large, dressed in worn leather vests adorned with patches. Their motorcycles, a mix of chrome and matte black, were parked in a neat row. They were laughing, their voices deep and rumbling. Sarah instinctively tensed, pulling Leo a little closer. They were the kind of men she had been taught to be wary of, a physical embodiment of a danger she couldn't define. She hurried out of the store, trying to steer Leo away from them. But Leo, ever curious, had stopped. He was staring, his head cocked to one side, at the largest of the men. The man was built like a refrigerator, with a thick gray beard that covered most of his face and arms covered in intricate tattoos. He was leaning against his bike, drinking a bottle of water. "Mommy," Leo said, his voice piping and clear, pointing a small finger. "Look, that man has your picture on his arm." Sarah's heart stopped. She followed Leo's gaze. There, on the man's muscular forearm, was the tattoo. A thorny rose, its petals a deep, blood red, its stem a twisting black vine. It was identical to hers, to Mark's. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Was he one of Mark's friends? Was this a trap? The man, hearing Leo's voice, turned his head. His eyes, surprisingly gentle in his weathered face, met hers. He looked at Leo, then at his own arm, then back at Sarah's terrified face. He saw her flinch, saw the way she pulled her son behind her. He saw the faint, purple shadow of a bruise under her eye that her makeup hadn't quite concealed. Something shifted in his expression. The laughter lines around his eyes deepened, but the mirth was gone, replaced by a profound, immediate understanding. He took a slow step forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. The other men fell silent, watching. "It's a nice drawing, isn't it, little man?" the biker said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, but soft. He knelt down, bringing himself to Leo's level. "I got this a long time ago, for someone I lost." He looked directly at Sarah then, and his gaze was heavy with a sorrow that she recognized. He wasn't one of Mark's friends. He was something else entirely. "My name's Grizz," he said, still looking at her. "You and the little guy, you okay?" Sarah couldn't find her voice. She just shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. It was all the answer he needed. He didn't press for details. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a worn business card. He offered it to her. "The Sentinels," the card read. Below the name was a simple logo of a shield with a wing on either side, and a single phone number. "We listen," Grizz said, his voice firm but kind. "When it feels like no one else will. Call this number. Someone will answer. Day or night. I promise." Sarah took the card, her fingers brushing his. His hand was calloused and warm. She looked down at the card, then back up at his face. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of something other than fear sparked inside her. It wasn't quite hope, not yet. It was just the possibility of it. That night, after putting Leo to bed, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the small card a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. Mark had driven by twice, his car's engine a familiar, menacing growl in the quiet street. She hadn't called the police. She knew what they would say. For hours she just stared at the number. The Sentinels. It sounded like something out of one of Leo's comic books. Felt foolish, desperate. But what other choice did she have? The system had drawn its line in the sand, and she was on the wrong side of it. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she picked up her phone and dialed. The phone rang only once before a calm, steady voice answered. "This is Evelyn." It wasn't Grizz. It was a woman. Sarah hesitated. Then the words tumbled out, a torrent of fear and frustration. She told Evelyn everything, from the expired restraining order to the picture under the door, the slashed tire, the dead flowers, the call to her work, the constant, suffocating presence of Mark. She spoke for 10 minutes without interruption. Evelyn just listened. When Sarah finally fell silent, exhausted and raw, Evelyn spoke. "Thank you for telling me, Sarah. I need you to send me the file numbers for every police report you've made." "Can you do that?" Surprised, Sarah agreed. "Good," Evelyn said. "Now I need you to do one more thing. Lock your doors, draw your blinds, and stay away from the windows. We're on our way." The line clicked dead. Sarah stared at her phone, bewildered. On our way. Who was we? An hour later, Grizz stood in the garage of a small auto body shop on the industrial side of town. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Evelyn. It contained a case file number and a simple address. Elm and 3rd. Grizz looked at the handful of men gathered around him, their faces illuminated by the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. He read the address aloud. "It's time," he said. The call went out. It wasn't a chaotic roar, but a quiet, efficient cascade of information. A text chain, a coded message on a private server. The message was simple. "Shields up. Elm and 3rd. Leo's watch is active 7:15 p.m. A high school history teacher grading papers in his suburban home saw the message. He closed his laptop, kissed his wife, and walked to his garage, pulling the cover off a pristine Harley-Davidson. 7:22 p.m. A chef finishing his shift in a downtown restaurant wiped his hands on his apron, nodded to his sous chef, and walked out the back door, his motorcycle keys already in his hand. 7:30 p.m. An accountant in a high-rise office building logged off her computer, swapped her heels for a pair of sturdy boots, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. The Sentinels were not a gang. They were veterans, mechanics, lawyers, teachers, nurses, men and women bound not by territory, but by a code. A code born from the shared experience of seeing the system fail the vulnerable. Many were veterans who had seen the horrors of war and came home to find a different kind of battle being lost in their own communities. They had formed to be the shield for those who had none. 8 p.m. The mobilization was complete. From all corners of the city they converged. 10 bikes became 20. 20 became 50. A silent, disciplined river of chrome and steel flowing through the city streets, heading for one destination. Evelyn Reed, a pro bono lawyer who volunteered as the Sentinel's advocate, made one final call. Not to the police, but to the city desk of the local news channel. "I have a developing story for you," she said, her voice calm and professional. "A community response to systemic failure in a domestic harassment case. Elm and 3rd Street. You'll want to be there." At 8:15 p.m., the quiet residential block of Elm Street was transformed. The first low rumble of engines arrived, a sound that made Sarah jump from her chair. She peeked through a tiny slit in her blinds, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was them. One by one, 50 motorcycles rolled onto her street. But there was no chaos, no aggressive revving of engines, no shouting. The riders moved with a quiet, practiced precision. They parked their bikes in a perfect, staggered formation along both sides of the street, creating a corridor leading directly to her apartment building. Then they killed their engines. The sudden, profound silence was more intimidating than any noise could have been. The riders dismounted. They were men and women of all ages and backgrounds. They did not approach her building. They simply stood by their bikes, their arms crossed, forming a silent, unbreachable perimeter. They stood like statues, a wall of leather and resolve. Neighbors, drawn by the initial sound, peeked out of their windows and doorways, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. They saw no weapons, heard no threats. They saw only a silent, watchful vigil. Sarah watched, tears welling in her eyes. They weren't here to fight. They were here to bear witness. They were a physical manifestation of the protection she had been denied, a living, breathing shield. At 8:30 p.m., a familiar pair of headlights turned onto the street. Mark's black sedan. He drove slowly, his confusion evident. He had come for his nightly ritual of intimidation. He expected a dark, quiet street. He expected a terrified woman hiding in her apartment. He did not expect this. He parked his car 20 yards from the building and got out. He was dressed in a polo shirt and slacks, the picture of suburban normalcy. He saw the silent bikers, the watchful neighbors, and his confident smirk faltered. He scanned the faces, looking for a leader, for someone to challenge. But no one met his gaze. They simply stood, their presence a silent, collective judgment. His face tightened with anger and a flicker of fear. This wasn't part of his script. He had lost control of the narrative. He took a step toward the apartment building, his bravado returning. "What is this?" he shouted into the silence. "You can't be here." No one answered. Just as he took another step, a white news van from Channel 8 rounded the corner, its headlights sweeping across the scene. A reporter and a cameraman got out, the camera's spotlight hitting Mark's face. He flinched, momentarily blinded. The public confrontation had begun. He was no longer a ghost in the shadows. He was exposed, trapped in the glare of 100 unblinking eyes. A woman in a sharp blazer stepped out from between two of the parked motorcycles. It was Evelyn Reed. She held a thick binder in her hands. She didn't look at Mark. She addressed the reporter, her voice crisp and clear, easily carrying in the quiet street. "My name is Evelyn Reed," she began. "I am a legal advocate representing this community." She gestured to the silent bikers. "We are here tonight in a peaceful, lawful assembly to draw attention to a systemic failure. For the past month, a resident of this building, Ms. Sarah Jenkins, has been the victim of a targeted campaign of stalking and harassment." Mark sputtered. "This is ridiculous. This is a private family matter." Evelyn ignored him, opening her binder. "On the 14th of this month," she continued, her voice unwavering, "Ms. Jenkins filed a report regarding a slashed tire. Police report number 78B45. No action was taken. On the 17th, she reported threatening materials left on her property. Report number 78B91. No action was taken. On the 19th, her employer was contacted by the perpetrator in an attempt to jeopardize her employment. Report 80C12. She was told, and I quote, "Our hands are tied." With each report number she read, Mark's face grew paler. These were not vague accusations. They were documented facts, a timeline of his terror laid bare for all to see. The camera zoomed in on his face. The mask of the concerned ex-partner was crumbling, revealing the snarling rage of a bully who had just had his favorite toy taken away. From the entrance of the apartment building, another figure emerged, flanked by Grizz and two other sentinels who had moved to escort her. It was Sarah. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a new, steely resolve. She had spent weeks being silenced, being told her fear was invalid. Now she had a voice. She walked toward the reporter, stopping a safe distance from Mark. "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength with every word. "That man is my ex-partner, Mark Stanton. For months, he has made my life and the life of my son a living hell. I did everything I was supposed to do. I called the police. I filed the reports. I begged for help. And I was ignored." She held up the photograph he had slid under her door. "He left this for me. He told me I still belong to him. I don't. I belong to myself. And my son deserves to grow up without being afraid." Mark lunged forward, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "She's lying. She's turning my own son against me." Before he could take a second step, Grizz and another sentinel moved, not to touch him but to simply stand in his way. An immovable wall. At that moment, a police cruiser, its lights flashing but siren off, pulled onto the street. But it wasn't Officer Miller who got out. It was a sergeant, a man with 3 stripes on his sleeve and a weary but determined look on his face. The news camera, the crowd of silent witnesses, and the calm, evidence-based presentation by a lawyer had changed the equation. This was no longer a minor domestic dispute. It was a public crisis, and it required a real response. The sergeant, a man named Davies, walked directly to Evelyn. He had clearly been briefed, likely by a frantic captain who had seen the live news feed. "Ma'am, can you tell me what's going on here?" he asked, his tone professional. Evelyn closed her binder. "Certainly, Sergeant. We are exercising our right to peaceful assembly to support a citizen who has been repeatedly failed by your department. This binder contains copies of every report Ms. Jenkins has filed, along with time-stamped photos of the property damage and printouts of harassing text messages Mr. Stanton sent before he started using a blocked number. The evidence is all here. It has been here for weeks." She handed him the binder. Davies took it, his eyes scanning the first page. He glanced over at Mark, who was now being filmed trying to argue with the impassive bikers, his voice cracking with desperation. He then looked at Sarah, who stood her ground, her chin held high. The calculus was simple. On one side was a man exposed and ranting. On the other was a woman with a mountain of documented evidence, a legal advocate, 50 silent witnesses, and a live news crew. "Ms. Jenkins," Sergeant Davies said, turning his full attention to her. "I'm sorry for what you've been through. I'd like to take a full statement from you right now, if you're willing." Sarah nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It was a tear of relief. Evelyn stayed by her side as she gave her statement, ensuring every detail was recorded accurately. As Sarah spoke, 2 more patrol cars arrived. The officers calmly and quietly took statements from some of the neighbors, who, now feeling safe, were eager to report the black sedan they had seen circling the block for weeks. The public confrontation had given them the courage to speak. Mark Stanton, meanwhile, was finally silent. He stood by his car, defeated, the camera lights still on him, capturing his public humiliation. When Sergeant Davies finished with Sarah, he walked over to Mark. "Mr. Stanton, based on the evidence provided and the corroborating testimony from witnesses, I'm placing you under arrest for aggravated stalking and harassment." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was crisp and final in the night air. As he was led to the patrol car, he looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She didn't look away. She simply watched as the system she had tried so hard to engage finally, belatedly, worked. After the police cars and the news van had gone, the sentinels remained. They didn't celebrate. They simply stayed, a few taking up quiet positions at either end of the block. Grizz walked over to Sarah. "We'll have a couple of people here through the night," he said. And tomorrow. Just until the emergency protective order is processed. Thank you, she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. I don't know how to thank you. Grizz looked over at her apartment building, at the window where a night light cast a soft glow in Leo's room. No thanks needed, he said. We just listened. The next morning, Mr. Henderson, the landlord, was at her door at 9 a.m. sharp, not with a complaint, but with a toolbox. He installed a new deadbolt with a heavy-duty strike plate, apologizing profusely about the misunderstanding by noon. Mrs. Gable came by, not just to check in, but with a warm casserole in her hands and an invitation for Leo to play with her grandchildren that afternoon. Other neighbors, people Sarah had only ever exchanged polite nods with, stopped by. One offered to help her patch the slashed tire. Another gave her the number of a free legal aid clinic. The wall of silence and fear that had isolated her had been broken. The Sentinel's public stand had not only protected her from Mark, it had given the entire community permission to care. The legal process moved with a speed that was astonishing compared to the previous inertia. With Evelyn Reed navigating the system and the district attorney's office now under public scrutiny from the news report, Mark Stanton was arraigned and held on bail he couldn't afford. The temporary restraining order was granted within hours, and a court date for a permanent one was set. Sarah spent the next few days in a daze of relief. The constant hum of anxiety that had been her companion for so long had faded. She could sleep through the night without waking at every creak of the building. She could walk to the store without looking over her shoulder. She could push Leo on the swings at the park and feel the sun on her face without a knot of dread in her stomach. The Sentinels maintained their quiet watch for 3 days, a rotating shift of 2 or 3 members always visible at the end of the block. Their presence was a comfort, a silent promise that she was no longer alone. On the 4th day, Grizz came to her door. The order is solid, he told her. He's in the system and he's got a tracker on him as a condition of his bail. He comes within 500 yards of you, we'll know before the cops do. But he won't. His kind of power is based on secrecy. We took that away. He handed her a new card. It had Evelyn's direct line and his own personal cell number. You're not alone in this, Sarah. Not anymore. Sarah looked at the man who had been a complete stranger just a week ago, a man she would have been afraid of under any other circumstance. She saw the thorny rose on his forearm, the symbol that had once been her brand of shame. But now she saw it differently. It was a reminder that the same symbol could mean different things. For Mark, it was about ownership. For Grizz, it was about loss and remembrance. And for her, it was now a catalyst for her freedom. She finally understood. The bikers hadn't saved her with force or intimidation. They had saved her by creating a space where the truth could finally be heard. 6 months later, Sarah sat in a different kind of chair, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and green soap. It was a tattoo parlor. The artist, a young woman with kind eyes and a steady hand, worked diligently on her shoulder blade. The old, thorny rose was disappearing, its dark lines being consumed by a vibrant, new design. Where the symbol of her oppression had once been, a magnificent compass rose was now taking shape, its 4 points sharp and clear, a single bright star at its center. It was her own design, a symbol of finding her own way, of being her own guide. Leo sat in a chair nearby, happily coloring in a book, occasionally looking up to watch the artist's progress. He no longer had nightmares. He was a happy, thriving 7-year-old. His world once again full of dragons and rocket ships, not shadows in the hallway. Sarah's life had stabilized in ways she had never thought possible. With the permanent restraining order in place and Mark facing a conviction, the fear was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. She had re-enrolled in community college, taking night classes to pursue her nursing degree. Maria had given her a promotion at the diner, making her a shift manager. She was building her life, piece by piece, on her own terms. The Sentinels had become a quiet, constant presence in her life. They weren't overbearing, but she knew they were there. Grizz would text once a week, just to check in. Evelyn had helped her navigate the final legal hurdles and had become a friend and mentor. The events on Elm Street had a ripple effect far beyond her own life. The story, broadcast on the evening news, had sparked a citywide conversation about the police department's handling of domestic violence cases. An internal investigation was launched, and Officer Miller was reassigned to a desk job pending mandatory retraining. Sergeant Davies was commended for his handling of the situation. More importantly, the Sentinels, working with Evelyn Reed, used the momentum to establish a formal nonprofit organization called Leo's Watch. Its mission was simple: to provide visible, nonviolent support for victims of domestic abuse. They would escort people to and from court, stand vigil outside their homes when a threat was imminent, and connect them with legal and social services. Their symbol was a shield with a single wing. The other wing, they explained, was the person they were protecting. Together, they could fly. As the tattoo artist wiped down her finished work, Sarah looked in the mirror. The compass rose was beautiful, a bold declaration of her new direction. It was not about covering the past, but about transforming it. She paid the artist, took Leo's hand, and walked out of the parlor into the bright afternoon sun. Her arm, once a canvas for someone else's story of possession, now bore a map of her own making. She was free, not because someone had rescued her, but because one small boy had spoken the truth to a stranger, and that stranger had chosen to listen. It was a quiet act of courage, amplified by a community that refused to look away, proving that sometimes the most powerful force for justice is not a weapon or a warrant, but the simple, unshakable act of bearing witness.